It's 9 p.m. here in the French capital. You're watching live from Paris on France 24. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. These are the top stories. Shock and sadness across the globe at the news that Diego Maradona, considered one of the greatest football players of all time, has died at the age of 60. People are taking part in events around the world denouncing gender-based violence on this, the UN International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And as a 72-hour surrender ultimatum expires, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia rejects international calls for dialogue and calls for a halt to the fighting in Tigray. Good evening. People across the globe have been reacting with a sense of shock and sadness today after it was announced a few hours ago that one of the greatest football players of all time, Diego Maradona, has died at the age of 60. Or perhaps the pinnacle of the Argentine legend's career was when he captained his country to victory in the 1986 World Cup. Maradona was also loved at a club level, playing for the Boca Juniors and also for the Italian team Napoli, where he won the club's only 2 Serie A titles. But in later years, Maradona struggled with addiction and was hospitalized on a number of occasions during the last decade, most recently at the start of this month when he was admitted to a clinic in Argentina with undisclosed health problems. Well, Buenos Aires was where Maradona was born back in 1960. It's also where he grew up, in a shanty town on the city's outskirts. Well, let's head there now and speak to our correspondent, Declan McGarvey. Declan, just tell us what the reaction there has been to this sad news.
Well, it's just been an outpouring of absolute grief and disbelief at the death of Diego Maradona at the relatively young age of 60. He was seen as someone as being larger than life. The words that are often used to describe Diego Maradona have been immortal. He's nicknamed as God, the God within Argentina, and someone who had survived a previous heart attack and resuscitation from that heart attack some years ago. It's an outpouring of grief. People, as we speak, are gathering around the football stadiums where Diego Maradona used to play, particularly the Boca Juniors Stadium in southern Buenos Aires, Argentina's biggest team, and which Diego Maradona once graced. One woman there saying earlier in the last few minutes, saying he could have lived for so much longer. She said he was the greatest and the most humble player, and that he never played for money. He played for the joy of the game, which really sums up the feelings of Argentinians on this extremely sad day on the death of the footballing legend, the great Diego Maradona.
Yeah, as you say, an outpouring of emotion and a sense of disbelief. Stay with us, Declan. Let's actually listen to what some people had to say on the streets of Buenos Aires a short while ago.
No puedo creer, es una cosa increíble. Uno piensa que se puede pasar todas las tormentas que pueda haber, pero se ve que no. Terminamos siendo todos mortales. Estoy súper... No, estoy digiriendo. Siento que es un mal sueño, un poco. Siento que es un chiste. Quiero creer que es un chiste.
Lo primero que me dijo mi hijo de 12 años es: mamá, se murió Maradona. Y no lo podía creer. Y no lo adoraba, yo particularmente. Sin embargo, me dio pena.
Totalmente conmocionado, dolorido. Y te voy a ser franco, por ahí esto no lo querés sacar, pero creo que fue un gran tipo que no tuvo muy buenas relaciones a su alrededor, que se aprovecharon mucho de él.
Okay, so a lot of emotion there. And Declan, I just want to ask you, what was it about this one football player that made him such a focus of people's affection, even as we heard there in that soundbite, from people who didn't even like football?
Well, there was so much about Maradona and his life. There was the fact that he started in the slums of Buenos Aires and made it to become the greatest, arguably, the greatest football player who has ever lived. I mean, what a trajectory, what a journey. And that makes him so loved by Argentinians. There was the World Cup victory in 1986, Argentina's last World Cup victory, when Diego Maradona, threw really his own genius on the pitch and his force or personality, dragged what was a very mediocre team to a World Cup victory. it's also important to put that World Cup victory within the historical context of when it happened. 1986, just 3 years after the end of Argentina's last brutal dictatorship, where an estimated 30,000 people were disappeared and killed after torturing. The atrocities of that dictatorship were just becoming known in 1986. It happened 4 years after defeat in the Falklands War to Britain. This was a point when Argentina was at its lowest ebb. It was morally on its knees. And Diego Maradona in 1986, by dragging Argentina to that World Cup victory on his own merits, gave Argentina back its national pride. He put the country back in the national spotlight for the first time in years in a positive light. And for that reason, for many Argentinians, Diego Maradona transcended the sport of football. He was bigger than football, and he meant so much more to them than the sport of football. And for that reason, he carried the nickname El Dios, God, and was described with adjectives such as immortal. And for that reason, today, Argentinians are in a state of shock and disbelief and absolute mourning.
Yeah, and indeed, his health hadn't been great in recent years. At the beginning of this month, he was admitted to a clinic. We're not quite sure why he was admitted to that clinic at the start of the month. But any more indications or clues as to what happened and you know, what was it? What the circumstances of his death?
Right, so more details have become known in the last few minutes. We do know that Maradona had spent the day at his home in the northern suburbs of Buenos Aires with his medical team, which included a nurse and a psychologist. Diego Maradona was known to be suffering from depression and from addiction withdrawal symptoms following a serious operation earlier this month to withdraw a blood clot from his brain. Then it's known that he complained of feeling unwell earlier today, and that was before clearly he suffered this massive and sudden heart attack. We do know that 3 ambulances arrived to his property in those northern suburbs of Buenos Aires within 5 minutes of the emergency call, but the ambulance staff were unable to resuscitate Maradona. Now, we also know that the police have been taking statements from that medical team who were present with Maradona at his home today. They've taken statements from Maradona's family. We know that in the next few minutes, Maradona's body is going to be transferred to a nearby morgue, and that his family has given authorization for an autopsy to take place. Now, local media is saying that autopsy will take place tomorrow, Thursday at 7 a.m. in the morning, but those media reports are so far unconfirmed officially, and that's what we have so far. Meanwhile, within the context of all of that, it's just a national outpouring of grief and pain. Diego Maradona, Argentina's greatest son, the greatest footballer who ever walked the planet, dead at the age of 60. They can't believe it here.
Okay, well, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed. Declan McGarvey in Buenos Aires, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, for more, I'm joined here in the studio by our sports editor, Simon Harding. Simon, thanks for joining us. As we were hearing there, a huge sense of emotion, a huge sense of sadness in Buenos Aires. But, I mean, it's fair to say that sense of emotion is perhaps equaled in other parts of the world. Tell us where else people will be feeling perhaps as distraught at that news.
Well, one place in particular that we know that people are going to be absolutely devastated is in Naples, in Italy. Maradona, who played for Napoli for a number of years, arguably he was in the twilight of his career, in the best years of his career as well, with the Italian club. He won for Napoli the only 2 Scudettos in the club's history. So we know that Napoli, and I believe there have been pictures already of people in the streets of Napoli celebrating, singing Maradona's name, chanting him, paying tribute to Diego Maradona. But Maradona was someone who went beyond the realms of football. He was such a massive icon in sports, Tom, that his demise, his death, is going to be felt throughout the world, regardless, as we heard from those testimonies in Argentina, regardless of whether you liked him or not, or whether you liked football or not. He was just this bigger-than-life character.
And yeah, in fact, we were just looking at some pictures from Naples as you were speaking. I mean, what would you put that down to? Was it his play? Was it his style of play, or was it his persona off the field that really captured people's imagination?
No, certainly his style of play. You have to start with that. Diego Maradona was one of those players that captivated anyone who was watching him. He was mesmerizing by his ability, his technical ability, his skill. He revolutionized the game. Before Diego Maradona, you had perhaps just a few players who were capable of doing what he did. Pele is one name that comes to mind. George Best, perhaps another of one of those superstars. But Diego Maradona, certainly with the rise of television, with the rise of sports and the media as well, just eclipsed that, because he rose in such a fast amount of time, but also because he embodied that Latin American player that left the homeland to go and play in some of the biggest teams in Europe. First FC Barcelona, then Napoli, of course. He also played for Sevilla back in La Liga after that, but he's just one of those players that you will remember forever for his exploits on the pitch, including winning almost single-handedly the World Cup for Argentina in 1986 with two infamous goals. The first, a hand of God against England, and then that mesmerising goal where he dribbled past 5 English players, sat the goalkeeper on their backside to then slot into the net. You mentioned his off-the-field character. Yes, he was known for his off-the-field antics, problems with addiction, with alcohol and with drugs, notably cocaine. He managed Argentina unsuccessfully in the World Cup in 2010. But what people will remember him by is for this incredible footballer that just, superlatives, Tom. There are no superlatives to describe Maradona.
Yeah, I mean, he had a sort of folklore aura about him, and it's not just the murals. So that's the off the pitch sort of aura of greatness that he had. Some people are likening him to a sort of a deity. In fact, those are the words for many people in Argentina we've been hearing from today. But on the pitch, people talk about his presence and how the team he was playing with would really feel Maradona's presence, and that would, his energy would determine whether or not they were going to win and how they performed. I mean, is that all an exaggeration, do you think? Or did he really was there something about him that made him a real sort of force to be reckoned with?
Absolutely. I think you just need to look at the testimony of some of the greatest defenders, arguably in the history of football. Franco Baresi, Paolo Maldini of AC Milan. They said that Diego Maradona was the most talented player, the hardest player they ever played against. You get in football these players that come along, they just lift your heart with a moment of skill, a moment of passion. And Diego Maradona was able to do this time and time again, to replicate feats of greatness. And when you see that day in, day out, and when you're playing with someone like that, there's the saying in football that you raise your game when you're with these top players. Well, it certainly was that, and his adventure with Napoli shows that. He arrived in Napoli in 84, led them to their first Scudetto in 86-87, then again in 89-90, the only titles Napoli have ever won. Napoli then had, we could, say a couple of decades where they, were never seen again on the highest stage in European football, notably until the arrival of stars such as Marek Hamšík, who then went and broke Maradona's goal tally for Napoli. Edinson Cavani is another name. And let's not forget that Diego Maradona was twice broke, the transfer records in football. First for his move to Barcelona for £5 million, then for his move to Napoli for £6.9 million. So again, coming back to this idea that he was put into the spotlight at a time when football was put into the spotlight, which just gave them this even bigger aura that he was creating for himself on the pitch due to his technical ability.
Yeah, huge sums of money even today, but even more huge when you think of the context. It was 30 years ago. Thank you very much indeed, Simon Harding from our sports desk. Thank you very much. Thank you. Turning our eye to other world news. Now, today is the UN International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and people have been taking part in rallies across the globe denouncing gender-based violence. Well, it's a day on which governments and NGOs join forces to raise public awareness on the issue. But this year, coronavirus lockdowns across the globe have made matters of domestic violence even worse, leaving thousands of women with no way of escaping from a violent partner. Well, it's a little-known fact, but here in France, nearly half of all homeless people are women, and yet most homeless shelters are reserved for men. Well, the coronavirus lockdowns, as we've been saying, have made matters worse for women. but help is at hand, as a France 24 team now explains.
Somewhere in Paris,
Monsieur m'avait veramente tapé très forte. Il y avait des menaces tous les jours, que me jetait de la fenêtre, que j'avais veramente peur. Quand j'ai pris la décision, j'ai pris parce que j'ai dit, je suis veramente in una situation dangereuse pour moi. Un jour, je vais mourir.
she had to press charges twice before the conviction of her live-in boyfriend finally brought an end to 6 years of domestic violence. Working as both a cleaning lady and a nanny, since May, Barbara has lived in this small studio for €450 a month.
J'ai la liberté, j'ai le droit de manger quand je veux manger, et je me sens en sécurité. C'est quelque chose qui a changé mon vie.
Before she found this apartment, for several months, Barbara was sheltered by private individuals, thanks to a non-profit startup called Solinum. At its head, 26-year-old Victoria Mandefield. Seeing France's urgent shelters overflowing and unsafe for women, while most homeless people have smartphones, she created Thanks for the Invite, a digital platform connecting homeless women with citizen volunteers.
Nous, on croit beaucoup que l'hébergement, c'est vraiment la condition numéro 1 pour la réinsertion. On ne peut pas se poser des questions sur qu'est-ce qu'on va faire, sur ses démarches, sur son emploi, si déjà on ne sait pas où on va dormir la nuit. C'est complètement légal d'héberger chez soi une personne à titre gracieux. L'hébergement citoyen, ça existe depuis très longtemps, on ne l'a pas inventé, on l'a juste sécurisé.
A simple, supervised interface convinced this young couple to sign up. They had promised themselves that once they were established, they would help people in need, people like Barbara.
Je vais te montrer les changements qu'il y a eu dans la chambre.
Ici, j'ai passé les moments les plus belles de la vie.
C'est une association qui est vraiment super bien organisée et où en fait tout est très clair dès le début. On sait qu'on va pouvoir aider une personne qui a envie de s'en sortir, qui a juste besoin d'un coup de pouce en fait. Dans notre vie, c'est un petit effort qui dans la vie de quelqu'un d'autre aura un énorme impact.
During 4 months together, including full lockdown, Valentine and Guillaume became friends with Barbara. She's now invited to spend Christmas with their families.
Now, the French Health Ministry has just announced the latest number of new COVID-19 infections for the last 24-hour period. There have been 16,282 new cases of the virus, as well as a further 380 deaths. Well, France has been in lockdown since the 30th of October, and there has been a gradual decrease in the number of infections, hospitalizations and deaths during the last few weeks. However, today's numbers are actually up sharply on the day before. Yesterday, we announced 9,155 new cases. Today, as I said, more than 16,000 cases. The US President-elect Joe Biden is due to give a Thanksgiving address to the nation today in an attempt to unite the country in the face of the worsening coronavirus pandemic. Well, Biden is expected to say that tackling the COVID crisis will be his top priority when he takes office. Well, the number of new infections there has risen by more than 70% during the last 2 weeks alone, and that's prompted public health experts to warn against large family gatherings during the Thanksgiving holiday. Although President Donald Trump is still refusing to concede defeat, the delayed transition process has now begun. We've been hearing, in fact, from the US President Donald Trump saying that his supporters should overturn the election result in which he obviously lost. That is something we've just heard in the last few minutes from the US President Donald Trump, calling on his supporters to overturn the election, whatever that means. Now, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia has rejected international calls for dialogue and a halt to the deadly fighting in the Tigray region of his country. Premier Abiy Ahmed says that his country will handle the conflict on its own, however. Meanwhile, as a 72-hour surrender ultimatum ran out today, Addis Ababa warned Tigray residents to move away from the fighters, telling them there will be, and I quote, no mercy. France 24's Yinke Oyetade has this report for us.
As world leaders continue to call for dialogue in Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is making his stance clear. He doesn't want international voices to intrude. In a statement from his office, he said, "We therefore respectfully urge the international community to refrain from any unwelcome and unlawful acts of interference and respect the fundamental principles of non-intervention under international law." Hundreds have already been killed in the ongoing conflict between government forces and the Tigray army. The Prime Minister's comments come as the UN Security Council members and diplomats met in a closed-door meeting Tuesday. They showed their support for African Union envoys to go to Ethiopia. An exodus of refugees continues. 40,000 Ethiopians have already fled to neighboring Sudan to escape the fighting. Some made the journey on foot. Their situation is becoming increasingly desperate.
في عطش كمان أكل ما في لما تجي تجوع الناس الكبار كمان يقعوا في الشارع حتى عند أمي أنا ذاتي مردت في الشارع عندها سكري عندها ضغط لكن شنو لما مشت بكراعة حقتها ما قدرت وقعت في الشارع.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government has said it wants to protect civilians, including Tigrayans, but fearing death, many continue to flee.